I'm really happy to highlight this notion of belonging because I really feel that it was a theme that I wanted to develop throughout the book, and it really sort of captures, I think, Teit's relationship to our region, to its people, to its Indigenous people, to its politics. I want you to keep in mind, as you're listening to my talk, that he arrived here in 1884 at age 19 from Shetland, and I'm going to go into that later on. He was born in 1864, so he was 19 in 1884 when he arrived here. So I'm starting first with one of the, there's so many legacies attached to this man. I'm starting first with a later legacy, his contribution to the Indigenous political movements of the 1910s. So that reflects a strong sense of belonging. I think I'll launch this whole talk with something that Peter Kelly, who's a really important Indigenous leader of the 1910s and 20s, he was Haida. He spoke English as well as Haida, a very, very important figure. Teit had died in 1922 in October, and at a meeting in Ottawa where both were with the Allied tribes, and Teit and Peter Kelly and various others have been so involved with this Indigenous organization. Peter Kelly was there to give a speech to make his case on the land question. And before he made a tribute to Teit. And I start my last chapter with this because I just love it. Peter Kelly says, "Our esteemed friend, one who has found a warm place in the hearts of every Indian in this province, has passed away. J.A. Teit was not just a friend, he was a brother of the Indians of this province. He had their utmost confidence. He had their implicit trust. He was looked to not as a white man, not as a sojourner among the Indians in this province, but one of them, one who could present their views perhaps better than any other man of this present generation." And that's coming from Peter Kelly, a Haida leader who knew him so well. And as I mentioned, Teit died in October in 1922 in Merritt in the Southern Interior at the age of 58. Another really poignant Vancouver connection that I'd like to make is that he was back and forth from 1920 until he died to Vancouver, to St. Paul's Hospital for radiation therapy because it was first diagnosed with cancer. And so he was often at St. Paul's Hospital. And a friend of his, Sam Anderson, who's Shetlander, visited him while he was in Vancouver. And he wrote about seeing his Indigenous friends keeping vigil. He wrote, quote, "I was amazed at the sight. All around the hotel, I forget which one it was, on the pavement were Indians, sitting crouched with their backs against the building, patiently waiting for news of their best friend. Jimmy Teit was dying of cancer." So it's a poignant story with a kind of sad end, and I'm going to start with the sort of culmination of this end, what he was involved in toward the end of his life. I put this image on it was a photo taken by Homer Sargent in 1904, and I put this on the cover of the book because to me, I wanted to emphasize that sense of relationship, sense of belonging to this place. And what I love about that, Teit's on the left in the buckskin, by the way, and we have the names of these friends with him, and he was Jamie Manampkin, who was in Tlakatlak. And you can see they're in conversation. And that to me was, and look where he is, he's on horseback, which was so much a part of his life here in British Columbia. And you can see they're leaning forward and they're in conversation. The other photograph is also from the same trip. This time he's with Jimmy Kitty, another Tlakatlak man from Cook's Ferry near Spences Bridge. And again, you can see they're talking. It looks like a simple thing to many of us now, but communicating on this level was something that was really rare. An outsider, a settler Canadian, being in this close contact, being able to talk to these people that he's with. So it's 1904. Few people could read. Few of the Indigenous people, and maybe we'll go to the next one. Few Indigenous people in this province could speak English. Very few could write. And it was the language of the colonizers. So what an advantage this was to the colonizers. Any documents really show this on the Indigenous sides, because you see them signing with axes. And, you know, even Teit worried about this. You know, he said we should have thumbprints. I mean, anybody can make these X's. And it's poignant because, you know, you see one of the chiefs who signed with an X so many years in the Southern Interior, and then suddenly learned, probably carefully learned how to write his name. It's so important, and it's such a power dynamic that we need to consider. So this photograph, to me, I want to give you a sense of his belonging to the landscape, just to the terrain that is British Columbia. First of all, living in a log cabin, one of the only interior shots we have up there. We have him on the Stikine Way in northern British Columbia, taking an oar there at the front. And this is probably somewhere in the central British Columbia, probably in Chilcotin up in the far right. And then down below, you know, a familiar spot near Murray Falls at Spences Bridge, on horseback, on trails, walking, hiking, riding, sometimes by train, but he just knew this landscape, traveled it so thoroughly. He really, really loved it and had such a deep relationship, I think, a sense of belonging to this place. The next one speaks to what I'm going to be talking about next, which is this relationship with these chiefs who were had so much to argue in terms of so many things, and primarily their land base. It's just a very, very deep, close relationship with these chiefs. Tetlanitsa on the left, I'll have lots to say about him, who Teit really admired, but all of them. The next one, just to give a little sense of color, is that I really like that he was so connected to so many people in his community and beyond. And, you know, so often with outsiders, it might be a few men. With Teit, it was with the full community, with old people, young people, and women. He took loads of photographs, and I'll speak a little bit more about how valuable they are. But as you can see, what I love about these photographs is he became known in Spences Bridge as the local photographer. And people really came regularly to have their shots taken. Women with their families and their children, they became family portraits, really. And I love that women at this stage really weren't that keen on having photographs taken by strangers. And here you can see them looking, smiling. He's a friend. And so I really like that what this photo conveys. And if you go to the source of all of his photos, you'll see hundreds of photos just like this. So these were taken between about 1913 and 1915. So the next photo just conveys the leadership in the Southern Interior. This is a photograph taken in 1916. So the problem was for Teit, in 1908, he was invited by these chiefs and others to write a petition on their behalf to the Department of Indian Affairs. And mostly they were concerned about an Indian agent named Archibald Irwin, based at Lytton, who they really despised, I would say, and did nothing for them. He wanted him removed. But the other concerns of this petition, which is all written by Teit, is better health care, especially for the elderly. Day schools instead of residential schools. There was a big residential school right at Lytton. And resolution of the land issue. You know, this is 1908. It's just so relevant. You can read that petition and think, wow, you know, like it's all there. They're still agitating for the same things. Teit was a perfect job for this fit, as he had embraced socialism in 1902. So he was really really concerned about inequities in the province. And I love that he was, even by 1908, when he wrote that petition, talking strongly about against the 1% and the 99%. This is to a friend in Shetland, where he was from. I would not advise anyone to emigrate to this country except they had considerable money. The state of this country at this present time for the working and wage earning class is simply rotten. The country is swarming with idle men, and the war has set in to the teeth between labor and capital. Wages are going down, the price of commodities such as food going up steadily. To make matters worse, the Salvation Army and emigration and other agents of the capitalist class are bringing out poor people from England and other European countries on false information and dumping them wholesale in this country, with what results you may imagine. This great America is certainly a wonderful country and has undergone wonderful development. What is the result? All the wealth of the United States and Canada is in the hands of a very few men representing the giant trusts and corporations. 7/8 of the wealth is owned by the 1% of the people, whilst 99%, 1/8. This is what I really love. And these conditions are becoming worse, he writes. Things cannot continue this way, and there will be a great revolution in this country within the decade. It must come as sure as day follows night. So you can see he's of the right mindset to join this campaign. So he wrote the petition in 1908. In 1909, we have Indigenous groups from across the province. On the coast, we have the Indigenous Rights Association. In the north, we have the Nisga'a Land Committee. And we have these chiefs in the southern interior forming the Indian tribes of BC. These are all organizations. It's a major step for Indigenous peoples because they're coordinating across the province over the land issue. The fact that there had, aside from some sketchy agreements on Vancouver Island and one in northern British Columbia, which could be called a treaty, there had been no agreements over the land. As far as these chiefs were concerned, the colonial project stood on stolen land. It was a case they tried to make provincially, federally, and finally it looked like we can resolve this if we can overstep these and go to England and have it settled there. So 1911 is really a big year because they get a group together, 100 of them to come to Victoria to argue their case to Premier Richard McBride. And McBride accuses this whole agitation, this whole movement, these 100 chiefs from across the country of having, it's all been the work of these so-called white agitators, people like Teit. Otherwise, as far as he was concerned, the Indians of this province were well satisfied. This is just such a common trope, well satisfied with their position. Well, this sent them home furious. And after that, it just becomes a series of petitions, letters, trips. If we go to the next slide, we have the key political players for this period. We have Premier Richard McBride in British Columbia. We have Sir Wilfrid Laurier in 1911, who looks like he actually might address their concerns. But alas, he's defeated, and Prime Minister Robert Borden's Conservatives come in, and between Richard McBride and Robert Borden, you really have a wall. They create a Royal Commission, which is well known to lots of us, the McKenna-McBride Royal Commission, which is the chiefs all have such hopes in prior to it being struck that maybe this will help them to decide the land problem. Alas, sovereignty title is not to be addressed. And there's no Indigenous representation. It's a long, complicated, painful story. And the next decade becomes fighting this. Trips to Ottawa in 1912, where they meet with new Borden. Those are expensive. Fundraising, speeches. Teit is called in as their translator. We forget that you don't have translators. Peter Kelly made a great statement. He was there in 1911 in Victoria, and he said to the whole group of them, we can't continue to have missionaries speak for us, where we stand mute with this, we stand mute with the onlookers thinking that we have nothing to say. These chiefs were all multilingual. Many speak not only their own languages, but adjacent languages in Chinook jargon. They didn't speak English. So to have Teit, who was of the right mindset, who had arrived here in 1884, and between 1884 and 1894 had studied the language to the point of fluency. So they had a speaker. In 1911, he went to the big meeting, and Peter Kelly acted as the main spokesperson at that meeting. And Teit did the translating for all the different groups in different languages in Chinook jargon, the trade language. There was such a difficulty of getting through to the leaders, getting their points through. So with Teit, there was a huge trip to Ottawa in 1912, another one in 1916. The previous photo was taken in 1916 in Ottawa, another one in 1920. These were expensive, they were long, there were press releases, there were meetings with Prime Minister, and the big obstacle is on the right-hand side of this image, which is D.C. Scott, who from 1913 until 1932 was the head of Indian Affairs in Ottawa. So he was draconian in so many of his measures. Not just on the land question, by the way. There were two major petitions. The Cowichan on the coast had a major petition in 1909. The Niska had the Niska petition in 1913, which was to try to sort of get their case settled in Britain. And it was just nonstop work, which ended badly during their 1920 long stay in Ottawa, with the federal government overstepping everything and implementing the McKenna-McBride Royal Commission report without concern for title, treaties, or self-government. And there was another bill on the table, which was to give DIA, Duncan Campbell Scott, power to strip an Indigenous person or an Indigenous community of its status. So that was on the table. And both were signed into law on Dominion Day in 1920, a terrible blow. So next slide. So this was the backdrop. These were the characters. The next slide will give you a sense of the documents. Hundreds of documents like this. I have 2 binders filled with letters and petitions. It's really poignant to think of, too, how people came together. Look at all the names. They came from all over British Columbia. Many spoke different languages. I found it really interesting to see, at Spences Bridge, unfortunately, the train, the CPR came in, and some of the spurs came into Spences Bridge. And so you could get there fairly easily, but they would spend a whole weekend hashing out, a weekend or several days, hashing out a 1-page or 2-page document to get it to what they want. And they finally had a translator. The next one, they're wonderful documents because they are all named. The next one, Michael, is really great because it's a camlipse. It gives you a sense of what these meetings look like. You have Basil David on the left, a very important Shawapam chief. You have a missionary in the middle who was very helpful, Charles Teit, and you have Teit on the right. And then you have, what these meetings would have looked like. I wanted to just read a little bit, another Vancouver connection that is quite important. And that's that there was I'm kind of attached to this guy because I came from Nova Scotia. This is a newspaper man who came from Nova Scotia late in life. He grew up in Nova Scotia, was chief editor of a major newspaper in St. John, New Brunswick, and did lots in Ottawa. But he came as an elderly man in 1909, very esteemed, beautiful writer, to take over the newspaper, the News Advertiser of Vancouver. And he was called to a meeting, and he wrote about it. He wrote, my most treasured archival document came from him. And it's just every bit of it is so special. In his obituary, he wrote a wonderful obituary when Teit died. He said, he wrote about his first meeting with Teit, and it involves this politics. Several years ago, there was held in Vancouver a conference of British Columbia Indian chiefs, gathered at the request of Mr. Duncan Campbell Scott to discuss Indian rights. A friend invited me to attend. On a low chair by a table, among the chiefs sat a silent white man who took no part in the proceedings until the chiefs began to address the superintendent general, each with his own language. Then he began to interpret. As one after another of the natives poured out his complaint or expressed his opinions in various forms of Aboriginal eloquence, Mr. Teit, in a low, quiet voice, rendered his appeal or argument into clear and cultured English. I was struck with the simplicity, felicity, and clearness of his language. Every sentence was ready for the press. And though he must have interpreted from 4 or 5 dialects, he showed no doubt or hesitation, though he occasionally asked the speaker a question or made a suggestion evidently of interest, of clearness, of clarity. When it was over, I made some inquiries. I wanted to meet this man. After that, I met Mr. Teit sometimes when he came to town, but not nearly as often as I wished. And what he wrote in that wonderful obituary after Teit's death is just filled with nuggets like that. But it does give you a sense of just someone who was extremely involved in this battle, and it was all-consuming from 1910. It began with that 1908 petition until 1922. When that decision came down in 1920, then there was another round of protest from 1920 while he was dealing with those treatments in Vancouver of cancer treatments, and terrible to see him die in the middle of all this. So I'm moving on to the next bit now. So that to me was a huge chunk that took me, I would say, about 10 years. This next image captures the characters that come to life when you get into Teit's political work. And by the way, it was a risky job. As his friends told him not to do it. You'll lose everything. You'll be in deep trouble. They sent Pinkerton's spy agency after them. I mean, Indian agents were constantly monitoring, complaining about them doing this work. So this chief on the left, as I mentioned, John Tetlanitsa, is so important. Johnny Chilahitsa on the right from Douglas Lake, so important. Wistamnitsa, another chief at Cook's Ferry, Spences Bridge, so important. Basil David, I mentioned. I want these to become household names. They are so amazing. When Tetlanitsa died in 1918 of stomach cancer, Teit you just felt a huge sense of loss and devastation, just such a monument. So you're probably wondering now, how did she stumble across this story? Like, I have to say, if we go to the next one, I actually knew none of this when I first came to this. It started for me with a song project, and it speaks to this slide. I started out in music, and maybe it does connect. I really laid it on with our younger son, who was featured beforehand. It was really important to me, music, growing up in Nova Scotia, and I did a degree in music. But when I finished, I sort of thought, like I was out in the West Coast, and I really thought, okay, so much of my degree had been Western European focused. I was really keen on the music that comes out of the soil. What do we have? And I got this job, believe it or not. It was before the days of computers, and so I had a skill. I could actually listen to I could actually listen to tunes and transcribe them, I could put them down on paper. And it was important then because machines couldn't do it. So I got a job doing that. And among the songs that I was transcribing for some linguists here in Victoria were some interior songs from the Okanagan, Head of the Lake, Vernon, and Nisconlith, Shwapma. And I spent all summer transcribing these songs. I really wanted to meet them, and finally I did. I was so moved by meeting the singers behind those songs. After that, I started doing a little picking around to see, okay, I've just been up in the interior and I've met some old singers, and there is a tradition of singing there. It's rich. What else? I mean, is there anything else? Has anybody ever done anything? So I started digging around in libraries and found that this man, James Teit, had recorded in the same region. So this is late 1970s when I'm doing this. That's how old I am. He had recorded over 200 songs in the same region. He had not, these were on wax cylinder recordings, the very first recording machines from 1912 until about 1920. And there had been an earlier collection there he had made with another anthropologist in 1897. That's pretty early for audio recording. So I very quickly got myself to Ottawa to hear these and to get copies, and they had transferred them to reel back then. And this is what I had. I mean, I had pages and pages of notes like this, and I had photographs of the singers, and I had recordings. And this is a really beautiful and just representative of what was on this. If we go to this recording, this is a woman called Yopatko. I felt like you get to know her when you see her. She's singing this lullaby that the old people that I had recorded in the Nisconlith and Vernon knew. And it's playing maybe the trill of your tongue. You see Tate's handwriting. He's writing this in 1913 or 14. And he's saying, the women are singing this with their trill of their song. It's as old as the people. This has to be ancient, thousands of years old. And Tate's written so much about it. And if we're lucky, we're going to get to hear the recording. I have a copy of the recording. What I want you to listen to, first, you're going to hear Tate's voice announcing this song. Then you're going to hear a funny sound, which is a pitch pipe. Because with these recording machines, the speed varied. So with the pitch pipe, you could actually get it. A440, you could slow it down or speed it up to get A440, and you'd have it right on track. And then you'll hear Yopatko singing, like just such a powerful thing. And imagine 200 of these for me. I couldn't believe it. So let's have a little taste of this, Michael.
Number 6M58 bracket item 24.
Cradle song.
And that's probably all we need of that. So 200 of these, and some of them are really amazing because you hear the women laughing. There's one hilarious one where they're sticking their heads obviously in this big metal horn, and they just can't contain themselves. They're laughing. This is in Tate's little workshop, which is right next door to a house in Spences Bridge, by the way, which is still there. So then this became a high moment for me because next time I went back to these communities, I was raring to get there because I wanted to bring these copies of these recordings. So here I am at the head of the lake with Mary Abel, who's got the pink shirt, in her kitchen, with Nellie Gutierrez from over in Douglas Lake and Eva Lawrence on the other side. And they're listening to these old songs. Some of them were Okanagan songs, and they're listening to the Okanagan. You see, I had a little tape recorder there. They brought their tape recorders. You're not hearing them here, but I have a clip from here where they're singing along they're laughing, they're talking in Okanagan. I only, I understood almost nothing of what was being said, but it just people were coming in. The grandkids were often there. Hilda Belanger, who's Mary's daughter, who may be here tonight, maybe she was there often joining in the conversation. And her daughter, one of the grandchildren is now, Marielle Belanger, now a well-known sort of theater dancer. And she was often there too. It was just really quite a wonderful scene. This is a photograph by me. I love it because it's one of the few that I took that just sort of captures the feeling. The next slide is at my book launch, and I really love this slide because it connects to what is going on in the previous slide. I just mentioned Hilda with the long dress and the black jacket with the big smile right beside me over one shoulder. She's the Hilda, daughter of Mary there, who was at that kitchen table. This is my book launch way back in June 2019. And on the other side, my arm around the other shoulder, Sharon Sphinx, who might be listening, she said she might, who is another woman whose mother I spent so much time with, Hilda Austin, and just John Hogan, whose head is sticking up between mine, who's in Lytton. And he is actually involved in another Teit book volume there with Angie Bain, who's in Tlakamak from Lower Nicola. The two of them are involved in the next stage of Teit book production, which is very exciting. And you can see behind there with the red cap, Percy Joe, Grantee Percy Joe, whose parents that I also had the privilege of working with, and Mandy Jimmy, and right in front of him who's a distinguished linguist in Tlakamak territory. So if we go to the next one, pay attention to Sharon on my left, because there's Sharon. And this is just the power of Teit's photographs. So you've got Sharon in the middle. I just showed you there. I mentioned that I worked with her mother, who is a wonderful singer, Hilda. You can see her with the buckskin dress. Hilda was an amazing singer. She grew up in Lit. Well, she grew up near Spences Bridge, spent a lot of part of her life in Lytton. But residential schools, they were scooping up all the kids there. She had a grandmother who was an Indian doctor whose name was Chappelle, who said, "You're not going there." Anyway, I'll tell you the story. So she never went to residential school. But when Hilda was a baby, both parents died of the 1918 flu. So she had never seen a picture of her mother, and her father is photographed too. And there is her mother. And that is Hilda as a baby in her mother's lap. So that is the power of his photographs today. I mean, where Hilda died, some years ago, but, for Sharon, there's Sharon in the middle and her kids. I mean, this is all their family. And Cheia, Hilda's mother, is on those tapes. It's just, it's a powerful connection to this stuff. So as I said, Hilda and her sister Millie didn't go to residential school, which is just, they were among the few who escaped. The next one I want to, what I call part 3 of this is just, this was my music project that I just went through. I really spent a lot of time working with that old stuff, wonderful contextual, audio, visual, and also with the old singers, and trying to sort of piece together that musical culture, which was so rich and alive. But I couldn't escape a really big part of this picture, which is what the history is, the colonial history of the whole area. It drew me in. The history of dispossession, it just launched that for me. So Teit's story really gives a window into this. So now I'm going to sort of give you a little background. While I was working on the music project, he was a guy who collected all these songs, and I worked with the songs, and then started sort of like, okay, who was he? Where did he come from? How did he end up at Spences Bridge? So I'm taking you into that part of the story now. So as I mentioned earlier, he arrived from Shetland in 1884 at the age of 19. Shetland, an island archipelago way out way north of mainland Scotland. I only realized it when I went there in 2006, and it took me 12 hours on the ferry to get there from Aberdeen. He was 19. He came at the behest of his uncle, Scottish uncle, not a Shetland uncle, a Scottish uncle from Aberdeen, who owned that. If we have the next, do we have another? Yeah. So you'll see his name was John Murray, and he had this big trade store there at Spences Bridge. This is Spences Bridge as it looked about the time he arrived. The uncle who owned the trade store in 1883 wrote to the family in Shetland, his sister, who was married to Teit's father, and said, if you've got, there were 10 kids in the family, Teit was the oldest, is there any of them who might like to come here and work as a clerk in my store? So Teit did, and there's a really cute story that goes with this. The uncle wrote to his sister fairly often, and as mothers, we all sort of try to figure what to do with our kids on sick days. Well, apparently on Teit's mother's sick days, she pulled out all these letters, and the kids read them over and over and over again. So these letters from this Uncle John Murray probably were among the things that tweaked his interest. He was a bachelor uncle living here, so he came here. And he also had a stopping house, a sort of hotel there next door. And he lived in that little white bungalow. And this was Spences Bridge in 1887. His life exploded in many directions. A very important one was that he met an Anthropologic woman. So he's only 19. Within about 3 years, he's met a woman called Antco, and it was really another nice discovery, finding his ledger book and seeing in his ledger book that a woman named Antco is buying stuff on his account. Her name's there. 1887. They marry in 1892 in the Anglican Church. So through Antco, he seems to, probably the big impetus for learning your language, but also he joined in on the community's lives, hunting, fishing expeditions, social gatherings. And so here is a lovely picture, is one of the very few we have of Antco with Teit in 1897. It's just a treasured photo because, I don't know, it just captures them at such an important stage. It's taken in 1897. Sadly, she died of pneumonia in 1899. So they were together for 12 years. So this was relatively close to her death. Next slide. So here you can see what the chiefs across the province were dealing with. These little patchwork little dots of reserves that had all been put in place without any kind of formal land agreements. This is what they looked like. This gives you a sense of Spences Bridge. And Antco's reserve, that pencil thin one on the left, is up above Spences Bridge in its own little valley. And she and Teit, Antco and Teit, Teit preempted some land right in that 12 Valley, which I have, which is conveniently located right next to her reserve. And they lived there and established a ranch, huge garden, fruit, everything. And he's starting a career as a hunting guide. So it houses his horses and all his equipment for that as a base. So the next one just gives you a sense of where the Twal is. It's up that you can do a wonderful hike up into that valley. So to get there, they're kind of off the beaten track, which is very nice. It's a beautiful valley. So Michael, the next one is yours. I asked Michael for this because if you've seen Michael's Vanishing British Columbia beautiful UBC press book, oh my gosh, and so much of what Michael's done is beautiful watercolors of just tripping around and capturing in color and texture what represents so much of our province. And for him, it's the vanishing bits. So just gives a sense. Now down here, when Teit remarried in 1904 to a French rancher family's daughter, and the house was one of the oldest down there, and sadly, Michael captured it beautifully in his watercolors, and sadly, it burned down. just about 2 years ago. So this was Josie Teit. She was a fair bit younger than Teit, and she was hardly, he was so busy after 1904. One downer, I think, was that he was just away all the time, as you'll hear more. But this is actually in Nanaimo on their honeymoon in 1904. So 5 kids, I'll tell you more about. So a chance meeting. So I love this. Thank you, Michael, so much for including it. And the next one is a really big piece of the Teit story. So you know that from 1894, he's living with Antco, 1884 to 1894. Well, Franz Boaz is German-American. I figured it out, he's 35. Teit's 30. They're pretty close in age. He's based in New York. He's come from Germany. He's got a PhD in mathematics and physics, but he's moving into geography and very keen on this new discipline of anthropology through geography, really. And he's managed to get himself small contracts, trying to land a permanent job, ideally in a museum or a university. But at this stage, he's not doing very well. And you have to feel sorry for him. He's tripping all over BC. He's got these small contracts to sort of figure out where boundaries are, what the languages are. He's also been asked to measure people. He's got a suitcase full of measuring tools. He arrives at Spences Bridge, very discouraged. He's having a very hard. He hasn't really got the personality for doing this kind of interviewing and work. And he's an academic, really, and having a tough time. So he arrives at Spences Bridge at 4 o'clock in the morning in September 21st, or I think it's 21st in 1894. He's so depressed. He thinks, I'm done. It's just, I'm just making no headway. Somebody says, well, why don't you go over and find John Murray across the river? He knows a fair bit about these people. He goes to meet John Murray, who I just told you about. John Murray sends him up to the 12 Valley. Hike, hike, hike. He's not expecting anything on this hot September day. He arrives there, and Teit's not there, but Antco's there. And I just love this. It's one of the only places in my book where I kind of took some liberties. And I wondered, because he wrote to his wife and he said, I spent an hour with Antco and an elderly man. And I just thought, oh, I'll play with this a little bit. They could only have probably spoken Chinook jargon a little bit, and it must have been an awkward hour. But finally Teit came, and Boaz could not believe this man. He was fluent, he knew everybody around, and he offered to help him. So Boaz ran back down the mountain, got the measuring tools, came up and did a piles of measuring tools. Teit brought him a horse down to the hotel where he was staying the next day, and they went all around, and Boaz was so happy, and actually said, now, will you start doing some writing for me? And Teit said, sure. That was September. When he came back in December to check on it, Teit had like 200 or 300 pages already. So this was the beginning of a relationship that exploded for both men, really. I mean, it led to reports, full reports on the Ntlakatmak, whom Teit knew so well, stories, hundreds of stories. The reports Boaz would then, who then in 1896 got a job at the American Museum of Natural History, got a huge fund, a huge research grant from the American Museum of Natural History, the president of the museum, which he used to, and this was a massive project to sort of map the ethnography, the whole sort of anthropological history, cultural history of the whole Pacific Rim, not just our Pacific Northwest, but right over to Siberia through, that area. So anyway, in 1997, guess where he started this project? He started it at Spences Bridge in June of 1897 because, he had Teit there. He brought 2 relative novices from New York City with him to help him. And they had a wonderful week there in 1897. That's where they recorded some songs, and Boaz was thrilled. This was such a great start. And then he did something else, and it really is an aside, and I hope it doesn't take too long, but he thought, well, I have Teit here. He's got all the horses. He's a guide. He can take us on the first ever cross, land-based trip across British Columbia, up into the central interior, right up to Soda Creek, and then across to Bella Coola. A huge trip today, but then it was horse trails and Caribou Highway. Boaz was thrilled with this. Well, 2 or 3 days into it, with pouring rain, mosquitoes, and all, it was hours and hours of cinching up the horses and uncinching and packing and unpicking. And of course, everywhere he got, it was June. Everybody was off berry picking and hunting and doing whatever they do. So there was nobody around. It was 7 weeks of this slogging. And he got to Bella Coola and he said, I'm never doing this again. And that opened the relationship to Teit. It was like, this man can do it, and it really was from 1897 until Teit died in 1922 of Boaz eventually staying in New York City, by the way. Between 1900 and 1920, I figure that he made one trip in 1914, maybe, because he then landed a job at Columbia University. So then he was teaching and he really became immersed in academia. And with Teit doing all this work for him by mail, which is great for researchers, by the way, sending it in, whatever questions he asked, Teit would send in the answers. And he had George Hunt, who's equally interesting, who was Kwakwaka'wakw, with Tlingit actually doing Kwakwaka'wakw work on the Central Coast. On the coast. So the two of them were doing very similar work. So out of that came 11 major monographs. Look, the Thompson, and you can get to all these digitally now, but Thompson Indians of British Columbia, major, 1900. Then he went on and did, in 1906, he did another one on the, which you can see there, the title, the Lillooet, adjacent. The Shuswap adjacent to, on the other, major in 1909. Major work on basketry, major work south of the border, Salish and tribes of the Western Plateaus in Idaho, Washington, Montana, ethnobotany, major volumes of stories, in addition to huge museum collections all over North America. We have some here in Victoria. There are huge collections because Boaz is one of his most brilliant students, ended up with a job through Boaz in Ottawa through the Canadian government that established an anthropology division in a museum. And so it was part of the Geological Survey of Canada. And Edward Sapir, who was Boaz's probably most brilliant student, ended up at the head of that. Sapir was pretty close, a little younger than Teit, and a very much more, anyway, wanted to bring Teit onto his team, by the way, which he sort of did, but Boaz never really quite let him go. But Teit did wonderful work through Sapir. What I love about Teit's work with the Canadian Anthropological Division in Ottawa is that Boaz did a lot of work to get it into publication, a lot of editing, a lot of us today in the reserve communities today, Indigenous researchers love the originals. You love the handwritten originals. Once it's worked its way through Boaz's editing, a lot of the names of the storytellers are lost. A lot of the Ntlaka'pamux names are lost. You find it in the field notes. And fortunately, we have lots and lots of field notes. Those are housed, a mother lode is in Philadelphia, of all places, the American Philosophical Society, another big chunk in Ottawa through Edward Sapir. But Edward Sapir solicited the field notes. They came in droves, and he was much more into getting the field notes, but not issuing them in published form. So they're wonderful. They're really wonderful. So there's so much on family life, childhood training, political organizations, seasonal cycles. I mean, you'll find it, and you will find none of the racist lingo that you find in all of the works from that time period. Are the historians, the amateur anthropologists were just writing such demeaning, racist stuff. You know, Teit couldn't handle it. We also have, through Sapir, Teit is guiding up in the Stikines, Cassiar region, and really becomes close to the Tahltan up there. And they actually bring him on. We want you to work with us. And they appointed Dandy Jim, their esteemed, knowledgeable elder, to work with him. And so they had a couple of major summers of just work together up there. And it's so so special because of coming from them. They knew who they wanted interviewed, they knew what they wanted covered, and it really was ahead of its time. So the next document was one of my big finds, because you can see how prominent Boaz is in Sapir. You know, Teit becomes one of my motivations for this whole project is that, you know, the Indigenous people, of course, in the interior know about him and have worked with his papers and his monographs. But outside that, I mean, most people have not really ever heard of him, and that just didn't seem right. And if they have, for some reason, it's come, you know, he's come across as Boaz's assistant, Boaz's so-called informant. One of the sources refers to him as a sheep herder from the, you know, I mean, just these kind of images that are not him. So this one was in a major document for me, because look at the date. It's 1893. So I told you that he met him in September of 1894. Well, this is very exciting because it shows him gathering stories from an old storyteller. And there's another one, Chilageskit, who's part of this collection. And these are wonderful stories. He was doing this work, a lot of work in the community between 1884 and 1894. He was keeping inventories of births and deaths. He kept wondering, like, why this population loss? Where is it coming from? Those kinds of questions, really important ones. These documents are this is just actually a really butcher job, actually, of some handwritten notes that Marius Barbeau took, another ethnographer in Ottawa, took while they were in Ottawa in 1916. I just love what the notes contain, little tidbits. This is, look, across the river, Tetlanitsa is the chief. And this is a document that Tetlanitsa, who I mentioned before, produced in Ottawa while he was there in 1916. They were there for politics. But Sapir said to Teit, look, if they want some quiet time in a safe environment here at Center Block, you know, Parliament Hill, in Parliament Hill in Ottawa, he come over to the museum, which was right there. And so they came, and this was part of a land tenure document that Tetlanitsa put together in 1916. And it's just filled with like tidbits like this. Kwelinek, who's one of the singers, by the way, here she is. She's the head of the family. I love that. We've got most of the men were family heads, but we have a woman who's the head of the family. So it sort of breaks through that kind of gender barrier that we associated with these communities. So where did this all come from? The next one, and this is getting short shrift because I'm running out of time. But I left this to the very end. You know, I said Teit came and, you know, he was 19, you know, like he wasn't a fully formed person. He's just a kid. He's a teenager, really. I mean, he grew up in Shetland. I sort of knew a little bit and paid a little bit of attention to Shetland, but I got putting that one aside. It's too much. We don't need that. We have so much for British Columbia. So eventually I had to sort of like bite the bullet, and Shetland opened a huge window on Teit. This just gives you a sense of the distance. As I mentioned, a 12-hour ferry trip. And the little red dots, one is where Lerwick, the town where he grew up in, the only little tiny town in this island archipelago. But his family was from Fetlar, way up in the outer islands. And those outer islands have been populated by fisher farmers who were very much lived the lives of the Indigenous peoples here, and that had been during during the 19th century, as with Highland Scotland, they had been cleared. There have been 2 clearances in Shetland. So his island of Fetlar had been cleared of, I think, some 800 people who had been there forever. No rights to their land. You know, they didn't read or write. They were, you know, so rooted there. So you can see here, just gives you a little picture of of what Shetland looked like. Lerwick on the left, Teit as a teenager, and the women sustained themselves there by their knitting. Now, Teit, it turned out, before leaving Shetland, found out in his father's letters, was really into history, family history, the island's history. He changed his name so that it would reflect what he felt was 7 generations earlier, that it was the Scandinavian past that was important, that the Scots had colonized the island. So there had been 2 royal commissions to sort of deal with the inequities of these poor outer islanders. Look at these women, women in Shetland. There seemed to be a connection, a resonance there. These are Shetland women. Knitting was big. He worked with the women to, I really feel these museum collections are filled with work that was made by the women at Teit and probably Antco's encouragement, because it was another form of employment for them. It was more creative and they made money, good money. I found it really quite interesting that Boaz sent a linguist there 10 years after Teit had died, and said, I can't work here, and she wrote to Boaz, because Teit paid them too much. I liked hearing that. So it became sort of a cottage industry, what they were making, and I often wonder if the power of women, and I found a recent history of gender history in Shetland, and it really is about the power of women in Shetland to sort of sustain that economy, especially in the 19th century. The dialect maybe accounts for his passion for languages. The dialect was very distinct, still is today when they lay it on. Teit revered his dialect here. He actually went around looking for Shetland fishermen who had who had ended up in British Columbia, and in 1916 published a bunch of their stories. They would have all been speaking in dialect. That was really important to him. And just one last thing, he was the census taker in 1901 at Spences Bridge, and I love seeing him describe his nationality as not British, but there he is in his Shetland attire, but as Norse. His language was not English, Shetlandic, and his religion, which would have horrified his father, was not Presbyterian, but was a free thinker. So you just really get a sense of where he stood. And Shetland, I've given short shrift to here, but it opened a really important window on why, just the political orientation, the sense of belonging, which was so, and still is in Shetland, so strong, that I think when he comes to Spences Bridge, he recreates that and he looks for that, and he finds it in the Indigenous communities. He must have found it in Antco and her family. And I'm just going to end with this one, which is Byron Sphinx, to bring it up to date, who's the former chief of the Lytton First Nation, who instead, he said, I retired, and then they hauled me into this job. He's manager of this reconstructed village site at Boston Bar. And it just to me is just full circle of Teit, Teit's work being used there, the drawings, the sketches, the so much information that he provided of the old ways of doing things, of catching fish, of doing everything, of hunting, is being so beautifully incorporated there. And Byron lives and breathes it, and is just another huge fan of James Teit, and actually sort of said, when COVID lifts, we'll do a James Teit symposium. So I just love that it's coming full circle. So on that note, I'll end and love some questions. Thank you. Well, I don't know. There's, as I say, if anybody, there's just so many different, so many areas that could still be covered. As I mentioned, John Davidson and the botany, the work on, I would say Teit's biggest, one of his major contributions with ethnobotany. And there are notes scattered through the field notes in Philadelphia. But what happened was Boaz, after his death, hired someone to get that ethnobotany monograph out. And it's just such, you know, Teit really spent his life collecting and documenting plants. And it's just such a poor, it's just a poor representation of the final work. And it came out under Elsie Steedman's name, whoever she is, not Teit's name. And I just loved finding Josie Moran, the second wife, writing to Boaz after her husband's death when that came out, and said, oh, you know, that was my husband's major work, and it came out with somebody else's name on it. So, you know, there's a little bit of that went on too. But the ethnobotany is so huge. Nice Vancouver connection, as John Davidson lived in Kerrisdale to quite a ripe old age and ended up at UBC. The other thing I didn't include much of in my book was Brian Williams, the first game warden. There's a huge correspondence there because Teit was everywhere, and he was a hunting guide. He was trying to get affidavits for guides so that they were not overtaking what they were supposed to be taking, advocating for no hunting. And, you know, so there's a whole story there to be told as well. And also I love that he was urging the Tahltan to strike because he felt they should be getting higher wages from the other guides. So you can just see that all through his life, you know, advocating for what's right and good. So yeah, it's good. Oh, somebody's asking, is the ethnobotany book available? Yes, it is available. All of these are available online. I have an original copy, but if you type, it's called Thompson Ethnobotany, you should be able to get to it. All of those monographs that I saw, the American Museum of Natural History, you can go onto their website and get digital versions of them. Highly recommend doing that. But even better, I would say people need to get to the American Philosophical Society digital notes on the plants, you know, especially David Walcom's community. David Walcom would love, David, you would love that, to get just, you know, all this work with women on these plants. And as I say, the zoology department at UBC also has the notes and collections there too, the plants. So, you know, there's many projects. I mean, that's, I think, why it took me so long. I mean, the politics took me about 10 years to kind of figure even out the basics. And then there's all the anthropology. And then, you know, as there's all this documentation of wildlife, and he just never stopped. That's what I felt sorry for the second wife, Josie Moran, because I actually don't think he was ever home, because look, he's doing all that politicking too. He's in Ottawa, he's in Victoria, he's everywhere. Now, interesting, those little churches, I'd be interested in David's perspective on this, David Walcom's perspective on this, because I was talking to Ruby about you know, there you have their little church, St. David's, I think it is, over at the Stein, which is now burned down. And directly across the river, you have the stone church associated with the residential school, St. George's. And it was really interesting listening to Ruby Dunson a couple of weeks ago talk about, you know, they were night and day. They were both churches. They were both Anglican, but she sort of said one is just, you know, and can have nothing to do, doesn't even want to go into. But the other one, St. David's on the Stein Reserve, she said she associates with warmth and gatherings and people bringing food and singing, and it was a community focal point. I don't know what David would have to say, because he knows those churches you're talking about.
David, can you unmute and
Are we putting you on the spot, David?
A bit, but yeah, the churches at Bekeist and here in Spences Bridge were before the residential schools system, and they were friendly. I guess our people accepted them, as how I would say it. In 1905, when the slide came down and took out our village at Spences Bridge, that's when my grandfather came and brought the materials to build that church you see now, which was put up in 1905. Our elders, when I was growing up, when the church was being used, it was the older people that were there, and they It was part of their life, but it's not so much part of life now. Both churches were, I guess, given back to us by the Anglican Church. And we're in a process right now of trying to get renovation. We're working with one of the renovation societies in BC to try to get them renovated. Just from they're not seen, as you said, not seen as by some of the people as the residential church, school church, but more as that's where my family was.
They had 5. And she was really, and you know, as I say, I have a photograph in my book I should have included, because it is one of the most, you put it right at the back of my book, and it's the 5 kids. They're little, they're young, you know, like they're little, you know, they're early teens down to about 4 or 5. Eric, Sigurd, Thor, Magnus, and Inga. And there's a beautiful picture sitting on the house, which David knows well, is still there, but you know, a little arts and craft bungalow with the building beside the house, which he built as his workshop. And it sounds like people just went by. And David's one of your relatives, who was the one who was good Teit's good buddy. I mean, they all came by, everybody, women, men, everybody, to sort of sit there and spend the evening smoking and singing and talking. And it sounds like it was a hub of activity and meeting and people in a very friendly way. It was just a whole different spin on anthropology, I'd say. Yeah. And that's why I feel like anthropology needs to honor this man, you know, that he should be seen. They talk about participant observation, and they have a big star as to really, you know, the guy who really was the first participant observer, you know, the guy who really lived out there with the people. Well, I don't know if there was one who's lived 40 years with the people and really just, you know, I love hearing that even in his letters, he goes out hunting with everybody and he's fixing irrigation ditches, like, you know, you're still doing, I'm sure. And he's out there fixing irrigation ditches there, out deer hunting. And then there's the thing, and I'm going back to the village tonight to give some of my meat to the elders. It's just, yeah. And by the way, you know, there wasn't just the land question, conscription. He was horrified that now the government was going to conscript these people. You know, they had no rights, no nothing. And now you're going to haul them over and make them fight. You know, so conscription for Peter Kelly and Teit was just a huge, and I would say of all his battles, he won that one. They won that one. They just went full bore on that one. And then the other one, which is the potlatch ban. And that was D.C. Scott pushing hard for, you know, convictions. And Teit, as a peer in Ottawa, put together a group to sort of write to D.C. Scott of anthropologists, Boaz and various others, and include Teit. Most people wrote a page or two, as, you know, added to this petition. And Teit wrote 12 eloquent pages. Not that even in your area, David, the potlatch is what it was on the coast, but it was a big part of funerals. And it's just the most wonderful, one of the most wonderful documents that he produced. And, you know, the potlatch in this region wasn't at all what it was on the coast. And yet when you read this 12-page thing by Teit, you were totally convinced at the end of it that this potlatch ban is incredibly unjust. Yeah. So, you know, many campaigns that I have only touched on.
Cradle sound.